Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering the 20 best weapons for Honor Mode in Act 2. In part 1 of this video, I went over the 20 best weapons in Act 1 and talked about how I'm rating these weapons, so go check that one out if you haven't. Now, Act 2 has very little loot overall. In fact, there's only about 40 weapons in all of Act 2, so to be honest, I have had to dig a little deep to get to a top 20 for this act. Now, far be it from me to suggest that you not watch parts of my videos, that would make me a bad YouTuber, but in the interest of respecting your time, I will say that I've included some weapons in this list where their special effects don't work on Honor Mode, they only work on Tactician difficulty or below, either due to intentional balancing decisions or bugs. So, if you are playing on a lower difficulty setting, you should definitely watch the whole video. If you are looking for specifically Honor Mode advice, you actually won't miss that much if you skip to weapon number 15 on the list. So, up to you, obviously, you can still learn stuff from the first weapons and the honorable mentions, but I do want to mention that in the interest of respecting everyone's time, because there are so few weapons in this act. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Michael Meepoke for the $10 donation, Josh Hobbs for the $5, Jonathan Zverling for the $20, and Levi and Gonzalo Mena Fuenzalida for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support. Alright, let's talk weapons. We're going to begin with 2 honorable mentions, or in this case, really 2 dishonorable mentions, the first of which is the Twist of Fortune. The Twist of Fortune is a +1 Morning Star, and you'll remember that I already honorable mentioned +1 Morning Star in Act 1, because the Heartstopper weapon action is so powerful. That's still true in Act 2, although its utility has definitely decreased compared to in Act 1. But the Twist of Fortune also comes with a unique weapon action. It lets you attack an enemy once per short rest, dealing damage equal to your proficiency bonus for every 300 gold in their inventory. Your proficiency bonus is usually going to be +4 around this time, +3 or +4 depending on when you're actually attacking with this weapon, meaning that if you have an enemy with, say, 400 health, they need 30,000 gold, and you will one-shot that enemy with this effect. You can ensure that they have this money by reverse pickpocketing the money into their inventory to whack them with the Twist of Fortune and one-shot them. Now, since patch 5, this used to not be true, but since patch 5, this gold then gets consumed on use, so you're basically spending tens of thousands of gold to skip an encounter. For most Honor Mode runs, this is not going to be a particularly powerful plan, because you just don't have the money in order to spend tens of thousands of gold per encounter. Though if there is a fight that you know for sure you cannot win, because for whatever reason that encounter perfectly counters your builds, this is one option for getting past that encounter, because you can reverse pickpocket it, one-shot that enemy, and then you will be able to avoid an encounter that you would not otherwise be able to be victorious in. But really this item is for use if you are using trading exploits and generating infinite amounts of money. Then you can use it to one-shot pretty much every enemy in the game. It's worth noting that this damage is dealt in separate instances, so enemies with damage reduction will still avoid the damage. They'll reduce the damage. If they have piercing resistance, it will also, of course, have the incoming damage. But because it is dealt in separate instances, some damage riders, like Falaraluv, will work to increase it, so you will be able to do some math to calculate exactly how much gold you need to spend to defeat each enemy. I don't recommend this as a primary strategy because it's extremely tedious, but it is worth mentioning this item because of its ludicrously powerful effect if you have infinite gold to spend on it. Our second dishonorable mention is the Rat Bat. The Rat Bat is a great club that gives you advantage on your attacks against beasts. Now, this advantage does function whether or not you're actually holding the Rat Bat or not, so you can use this on an archer character or a spellcaster and get advantage on attacks against beasts, but there's very few encounters with beasts in the game, and none of them are particularly challenging, so that effect is just not one that I'd go out of my way to get. The real advantage of the Rat Bat, though, is that It has an unlisted extra d6 of piercing damage. It's not listed in the tooltip for the item, but it does an extra d6 of piercing damage because it's a bat with a nail in it. And on difficulties that aren't honor mode, this is one of the most buggy and abusable weapons in the game. Because that extra d6 of piercing damage is both a damage rider, meaning it's added to damage you do, and a damage rider source, meaning other damage riders add onto it, the Rat Bat will allow you to stack ludicrous amounts of damage and is the source of a lot of damage records if you go out of your way to stack other damage riders and damage rider sources alongside it. There's various like Reddit breakdowns, and you can probably find a video of somebody doing 10,000 damage in a swing with the Rat Bat if you go really far out of your way to abuse the bugs with this weapon, and especially on difficulties that aren't honor mode. On honor mode, some of the bugs, but not all of them, have been fixed with damage riders. The Rat Bat can do absurd amounts of damage. Mostly, again, this is for generating like TikTok clips where you show off how you do 10,000 damage in a swing, but obviously damage records are fun, so it's worth mentioning this weapon as well. Coming in at number 20, the Ritual Dagger of Shar. The Ritual Dagger of Shar is a +1 dagger that does an extra d4 of necrotic damage on a hit. This is less damage than a lot of the weapons higher up on this list, so it will often be eclipsed by some of the more powerful weapons later on. But the Ritual Dagger, in terms of sheer damage output, the Ritual Dagger of Shar is pretty useful for two particular niche reasons, and it makes it worth carrying around because you get it for free, and so this will be an effect that you will almost always want. Firstly, it's a decent weapon for dual-wielding characters because extra damage dice, like this extra necrotic damage, are very, very good when you're adding damage to a weapon. When you add it in the form of a die, it gets doubled when you critically hit with it. You can apply it several times per turn if you're doing a lot of attacks. And if you have a character that's dual-wielding weapons, or even multiple characters that are dual-wielding weapons, you're going to want a lot of good finesse light weapons so that you can make sure that you have the character equipped with the best one at every time. The Ritual Dagger of Shar is probably going to be your second best weapon in terms of light weapons when you get it, but that still makes it a great offhand weapon for dual-wielding characters. Secondly, it's useful just like every +1 dagger in the game as a backup throwing weapon. Because it is a dagger, it has the thrown weapon property, so it does its weapon damage when you throw it, not including the d4 necrotic damage, unfortunately. But this is useful because, as a dagger, it has a very flat trajectory. Most weapons, when you throw them, throw in a big arc, and so can intersect doorways or terrain or like ceiling beams and stuff like that, but daggers fly very flat. So they're very useful for either a dedicated throwing weapon character to have in areas where it's hard to draw line of sight, or as a backup weapon for other melee characters. This is a bit of a niche pick, but one that's very useful for a party to just have in their inventory for when it comes up. At number 19, the Thorn Blade. The Thorn Blade is a +1 scimitar that allows you to cast Ensnaring Strike once per long rest, basically like the Ranger spell, which is not a bad spell to have on a melee character, but once per long rest, a level 1 spell is not much to write home about in Act 2. The real advantage of this weapon is that it also does an extra d4 of poison damage when you are concentrating. That extra d4 of damage applies to all of your melee weapons, except not on honor mode. So on lower difficulty settings, if you have the Thorn Blade, it will add a d4 of poison damage to your other weapon if you're dual wielding. You can even use 2 Thorn Blades because you can get 2 of them and apply an extra d4 of poison damage to each of them. This makes it an extremely high damage setup for dual wielding characters in difficulty settings that aren't honor mode. On honor mode, this weapon is a slightly better version of the Ritual Dagger of Shar in terms of damage, but worse than other dual-wielding weapons that you have available, so you can skip this one on honor mode, but on lower difficulty settings, this is a very high damage setup. Moving on to number 18, the Justiciar's Scimitar. This is another weapon that's unfortunately, currently, bugged on honor mode. If it wasn't and got all of its effects on honor mode, it would be like number 6 on this list, maybe. It would be quite a bit higher up. So if you're playing on lower difficulty settings, this weapon is excellent and you should value it very highly. or if they ever fix the bugs with this weapon, which I hope they do eventually, or if a modder wants to fix it, then it will make an excellent honor mode weapon. As is, though, it's still pretty useful on honor mode and very, very good on lower difficulty settings. The Justiciar Scimitar is a +2 scimitar, good for dual wielders already, with a couple unique effects. Firstly, it gets the Backbreaker weapon action, which is normally reserved for heavier weapons and lets you knock enemies prone. That's a pretty nice thing to have on a light finesse one-handed weapon. Knocking enemies prone is obviously very good. Secondly, it lets you, once per short rest, use Shadow-Soaked Blow, which does extra damage equal to your proficiency and an extra d6, and doesn't break concealment. That's incredible for melee stealth characters, letting you get sort of a free attack before combat starts, keeping your character from being retaliated against. So that's a very useful effect even on honor mode, just a bunch of free damage at the start of an encounter. The real advantage of this weapon, though, is unfortunately non-functional currently at time of recording on honor mode, and that's if you attack with advantage, enemies have to make a saving throw or become blinded. Passive effects like that, passive debuffs like that are incredible. Attacking with advantage is pretty easy to do on a stealth melee character, and of course an enemy that's blinded by this effect is going to continuously get the blind refreshed because you'll constantly be attacking with advantage. It's also Act 2, where you get a lot of sources of advantage on all of your weapon attacks, so you can trigger this very frequently. That debuff is incredible. Blind is a very powerful debuff, and applying it effectively for free constantly is awesome. So if that ability ever gets fixed on honor mode, this weapon will be excellent, and on tactician or below, it's really, really good. It's especially good, of course, for dual wielding characters, because it's a dual wielding focused weapon, and for melee stealth characters. And you can still use this weapon on honor mode for like once per short rest, just getting a little bit of extra damage before combat starts. It's a totally reasonable weapon to carry around, but its real power level is currently bugged on the highest difficulty setting, so it's mostly for lower difficulty runs. At number 17, the Least Expected. This is a +2 shortbow that once per short rest lets you blind an enemy, so you can make a normal weapon attack, but also they have to make a saving throw or become blinded, which is a pretty powerful debuff for a bow to have. And whenever you are obscured in shadow, so if you are just in an unlit area or an area that has light or heavy obscurement, you don't have to actually be hiding, just in an area with lower lighting, you have a 1d4 bonus to your attack rolls with this weapon. A 1d4 bonus to your hit chance with this weapon is very, very good. Now, you sacrifice a lot of damage compared to the probable setup that you're using at this point, the Titan String Bow, but if you have an enemy that has very high armor class and you need a bonus to hit chance to hit them, the Least Expected is very good for that. If you have a character that is an archer but has a relatively weak hit chance for whatever reason, maybe you're doing some kind of off-meta build or themed build, then the Least Expected is very good for that. And it's also especially good for stealth characters because they just want to hit their attacks. So if you are playing a stealth archery character, then you can use the Least Expected to avoid missing attacks and wasting your wasting your skill checks with your stealth. In general, this bow is going to still be eclipsed by the Titan String Bow from the previous act, but it's useful for some encounters. It's also very useful if you have two archers in your party. One of them will probably end up using this alongside the other using the Titan String Bow. But mostly this is going to be used for the blinding shot, which is a very powerful debuff that you can apply to an enemy once per short rest. You can then swap to the Titan String Bow setup, or just continue to attack with this weapon against a blinded enemy for additional damage. Any weapon that just has a powerful debuff is always worth considering, and the Least Expected does that pretty well, so all of these effects together make for a pretty nice package. Coming in at number 16, the Azer Warhammer. This is a weapon that you have to get through an exploit. So I've dinged it a little in this ranking as a result, because a lot of players won't want to do it, because it's not really intended to be used by players. But you can get it if you summon the Azer, which you do with Conjure Minor Elementals. And then there's a couple different ways to exploit the game in order to get its weapon off it. It's supposed to be permanently armed, so you can't use the normal disarm tricks to get the weapon off it, but you can like get yourself arrested and then recover its weapon from the evidence chest. And I think there's a couple other ways to do it. So you can pick up this weapon as soon as you can cast Conjure Minor Elementals. Since you usually need to be level 7 for that, you will often get this sometime in Act 2, so I've included it as an Act 2 weapon. It's a Warhammer that does an extra d6 of fire damage, but has no enhancement bonus. So as a weapon, it's not bad. A normal Warhammer plus a d6 of fire damage is a pretty decent weapon for just attacking with. And it also provides you with a very powerful bonus action. The Overheat bonus action deals a d10 of fire damage to everything within 10 feet of you, and also sets them on fire, but it's super fire, it's this burning fiercely condition that does a d10 of fire damage as well. So it's basically a 2d10 fire damage explosion as a bonus action. A weapon that does pretty good damage when you attack with it, and has a 2d10 fire damage bonus action attack in an AoE, is a pretty powerful weapon for dealing AoE damage. This Overheat action is also at will. You can do it every single turn. There's no cooldown on it. I guess it has a 1-turn cooldown, so you can't use it twice in the same turn as a Thief Rogue with multiple bonus actions. But you can use it every single turn for an additional 2d10 fire damage to enemies pretty much every single turn. That is a pretty nice effect and will add a lot of AoE damage to your characters. You also don't have to use it on a weapon attacking character. Another character can carry this weapon and just have a little AoE fire explosion. If you have a tanking character, something like an Abjuration Wizard that's surrounded by enemies and doesn't really need their main hand weapon, this can add a little bit of extra damage to that character's attacks as well. Obviously, it is an exploit to get this weapon, but in my opinion, a pretty minor one. I think it's a fun and thematic weapon that's not out of scale balance-wise with the other weapons in the game. So I think, honestly, they should have just made this available as a normal weapon. It's especially good if you need extra AoE damage for your party, or if your character doesn't have another use for their bonus action, but an at-will powerful bonus action is always going to be good, and this one provides a quite solid one. Moving on to number 15, so welcome to the people who skipped to this point. As I mentioned in the intro, don't worry, I only said nice things about you in the interim. We have the +2 Hand Crossbow. The +2 Hand Crossbow is one of the best hand crossbows in the game, not because it in and of itself is a super exciting weapon, but because your options for hand crossbows are honestly pretty weak in Baldur's Gate 3, and so this one makes it pretty high up there for hand crossbows kind of by default. It's a +2 weapon, which makes it quite good at hitting, and that's mostly what you want. A hand crossbow character is usually just going to need to hit their attacks to deal damage with sharpshooter, and the +2 hand crossbow is one of the best at doing this. Now, normally for a dedicated hand crossbow character, I prefer the Hellfire hand crossbow, which is obviously just better than the +2 and will show up later in the list, and the Nair Misser, which we'll also discuss a little bit later on, as my 2 hand crossbows of choice. But there are 2 cases where the +2 hand crossbow comes up and is a very useful weapon. I guess note also that the only guaranteed place to get this is in Act 3, but it can also spawn in merchant inventories, so you should be able to buy one during Act 2. The first of the 2 cases is for random offhand attacks on characters that aren't dedicated hand crossbow users. Just like with the +1 hand crossbow that I discussed in Act 1, any character that doesn't have a great use for its bonus action can get a ton of extra value from just having a hand crossbow equipped, because if you aren't using your ranged weapon slot and aren't using your bonus action, that's just a free d6 +2 damage that you can add onto your character every single turn of combat. You can also use it for a bunch of utility, like breaking breakables and stuff. I go into more detail in this in the Act 1 entry, so I'm not going to repeat myself, but there's a lot of utility to that. The second is if you are a dedicated hand crossbow user, and your party is using the ballast armor. If you use the Nair Misser, it converts your damage to force damage, which is good in most circumstances, but bad if you have the ballast armor, which gives enemies vulnerability to piercing damage. In that case, you're going to want the +2 hand crossbow, and that is a pretty powerful effect. Whoops, it clicked a little bit too much there. The second case is for a dedicated hand crossbow user that wants two hand crossbows as its primary weapons, and is also using the ballast armor, either wearing it itself or has the ballast armor equipped on another character in the party. That will double your damage with piercing damage weapons, so if you're using the Nair Misser to convert your damage to force damage, you lose a lot of damage if you have the ballast armor, and the +2 hand crossbow will replace it in that build in order to make sure that you're still using a piercing damage weapon and getting the most possible damage out of the ballast armor. Obviously, that's an incredibly powerful setup, so the +2 hand crossbow is useful for that specific version of the character. In most cases, it's going to either be a weapon that is a random extra weapon for the rest of your party to use, or eclipsed by the Nair Misser for dedicated hand crossbow builds. But for ballast armor users, the +2 hand crossbow is a must-have because it does the most possible damage. Moving on to number 14, a weapon that we've already sort of discussed, the Nair Misser. This is the alternative to the +2 hand crossbow. They're kind of tied for second best hand crossbow, and in my opinion, it is very slightly better than the +2 hand crossbow, so will usually be the second weapon that you use for a hand crossbow user. It's a +1 hand crossbow, so 1 less attack and 1 less damage, but it deals force damage instead of piercing damage, which, unless you're using the ballast armor, is mostly a pretty big upside. There's a lot of enemies in the game that have resistance or immunity to piercing damage, and basically none that have resistance or immunity to force damage. And it also allows you to cast Magic Missile as a level 3 spell, so 5 missiles, once per short rest. That lets you finish off low health enemies, and hand crossbow users do a lot of damage per shot, so often it's pretty useful to finish off low health enemies. You can also guarantee after you fire off a big AoE attack from another character that you will be able to clean up anything that's left, because magic missiles never miss, so having a cast of magic missile once per short rest is very useful. The main thing here, though, is just that it is a weapon that overcomes damage resistances, and there's a lot of damage resistance to piercing in the game. So for your primary, or I guess your primary secondary weapon, your weapon that you will use as your second weapon in addition to the one that we will talk about later on, I tend to slightly prefer it to the +2 hand crossbow. A couple other things that are nice about this weapon: it converts all damage that you deal with it to force damage. So if you have ways to add extra damage to a shot, like for example, sneak attack, that sneak attack will also be force damage. Anything that just adds damage, untyped damage to your attacks, will be converted to force. So sneak attack characters get a lot of force damage with this weapon. Some enemies are vulnerable to force damage, and basically nothing resists it, so that's pretty nice as well. Moving on to number 13, the Punch Drunk Bastard. This is a weapon that kind of enables an entire strategy all by itself. It's a +1 Great Club, though notably, unlike other Great Clubs, it has a bunch of extra weapon actions, importantly Cleave, which I'll talk about in a second here. And when you're drunk, you have advantage on every single attack roll, which is massive. Advantage on attack rolls is obviously great, and you deal AoE thunder damage with every single attack. Thunder damage is great in Baldur's Gate 3 because it can trigger reverberation, so that can be used for one of the most powerful strategies in the game, stacking reverberation on enemies to deal extra damage and knocking them over. And because this is AoE thunder damage, it does so in a big AoE. Advantage on every single attack, of course, is always great as well, because you're going to get more critical hits, you're going to hit more often. I don't really need to tell you why advantage is good, but this is one of the easiest ways in the game to get it. Being drunk or having the alcohol condition is not really a huge penalty. It gives you some minor penalties, but it's not a big deal. And you can do it pretty regularly just by drinking in alcohol as a bonus action. In Act 3, there's also alcohol you can consume without spending an action at all, so it becomes totally action economy free in order to get this effect. The main advantage here, though, is if you hit multiple enemies in a swing, such as by using Cleave, or being a Sword Bard or Tiger Barbarian that can make AoE melee attacks, or a Hunter Ranger, then the thunder damage blast is going to trigger on each enemy you hit and hit each enemy in that AoE. So you can stack up 3d4, 5d4 extra thunder damage on each enemy for a huge amount of bonus damage and a huge amount of reverberation stacks. It does require building around this weapon and drinking alcohol before every fight in order to get the most use out of it. But this is a very powerful weapon that does a lot of bonus damage, especially if you're hitting multiple enemies on an attack, and can let you trigger one of the most powerful debuffs in the game. So this build around this weapon is a very good one. You don't want to use the weapon if you're not building around it, but if you are, it's super strong. Moving on to number 12, the Shadow Lantern. Now, the Shadow Lantern requires a pretty specific story choice, and you also have to have Gale in your party at the right moment in order to get this weapon. So a lot of playthroughs are never going to see it, but if you do get it, it's going to be extremely strong for you. Now, this weapon is actually quite terrible as a weapon. You don't want to attack with it because it's just effectively a non-magical light club. So you never want to use this as an actual weapon. But once per long rest, it lets you conjure a Shadow Lantern Wraith. This is a moderately powerful summon. It's basically the equivalent of like a level 4 or so spell in terms of its summon, the power level of the summon. But a level 4 spell, once per long rest, is pretty good, and a day-long buff is extremely strong for characters that don't need their weapons for other things. It's worth noting with this, the Shadow Lantern can be equipped in the Torch slot, but you can't get the Wraith if the weapon is in your Torch slot. It has to be in your weapon slot, and if you unequip the weapon, the Wraith despawns. So you do have to actually be carrying the Shadow Lantern to benefit from this effect. But for a lot of characters, it's worth giving up a one-handed weapon slot, one of their weapon slots, in order to have a super powerful summon following them around. A day-long buff in exchange for your weapon is great. Even better, of course, if you're a summon-focused party that has buffs that you can add, like AoE buffs or things that improve your summons. And any character like a spellcaster or an archer that doesn't have a specific need for their melee weapon slot can improve the power level of your party dramatically with the Shadow Lantern. This is a pretty powerful effect, but more importantly, it's free for a lot of characters, and I love free, so the Shadow Lantern is going to be excellent for any party which has a character that can afford to give up a weapon slot to use it. And moving on to number 11, the Sword of Lifestealing. The Sword of Lifestealing is a +2 short sword that deals 10 extra necrotic damage whenever you critically hit with it. Now, you do have to critically hit with this weapon itself. Unlike a lot of other passives, this only works on weapon attacks with specifically the Sword of Lifestealing, so it won't work on bow shots, it won't work on your other weapon if you are a 2-weapon fighter. But characters who are set up to use 2 short swords are likely to critically hit pretty frequently, and 10 extra damage every time you critically hit is a pretty big buff to the character. It's not, the 10 damage won't get doubled because it's not damage dice, and flat damage bonuses don't get doubled on critical hits, only dice get doubled on critical hits. So the 10 damage is actually 10 damage, and you get 10 temporary hit points whenever this happens as well, which is pretty nice, especially for a dual-wielding rogue character, because those characters can be vulnerable to taking damage. They tend to have lower hit points and be a little squishier than other melee characters, so giving yourself 10 extra temp HP can be a nice little buffer, but really it's mostly for the extra damage. If you are a melee build built around critical hit chance, then this is going to be an incredible amount of additional damage, and for any dual-wielding character, this does a lot of extra damage. At the point where you get this is certainly the second best short sword you have, alongside the Knife of the Undermountain King, and so most dual-wielding characters are going to swap to that setup in order to deal the maximum amount of damage, and this remains just an excellent damaging weapon throughout Act 2 because of the super powerful effect. I mean, this is just a weapon that does more damage than other weapons, and that's always good, because that's what weapons are for. Moving on to the top 10, which is where things get really exciting in Act 2, we have, at number 10, the Chargebound Warhammer. The Chargebound Warhammer is available almost at the beginning of Act 2, and is a +1 Warhammer, which at base is not very exciting, but when it is bound to an Eldritch Knight or Pact of the Blade Warlock, the charge-bound Warhammer becomes a +2 Warhammer with an additional d6 of lightning damage. A +2 Warhammer with an extra d6 of lightning damage is the highest damage weapon that you have at this point in the game. Right at the start of Act 2, that's just better than any other weapon that you have, and so this weapon just does a ton of damage for the characters that it's appropriate for. It's mostly used for melee Eldritch Knights. You don't want to use this for a thrown Eldritch Knight, because you're still going to be using a more powerful throwing weapon, one with the thrown weapon property, of course, and Pact of the Blade Warlocks, and for a Pact of the Blade Warlock, this is going to be your best weapon at this point in the game. So a lot of characters that want to wield powerful weapons, this is the best in slot because of how much damage it does for those characters. Not useful if you don't have one of these two specific kinds of characters in your party, of course, but if you do, this is going to be the best in slot weapon for them. Moving on to number 9, one of the weirdest and buggiest weapons in the game, the Lightning Jabber. The Lightning Jabber is a +1 spear that deals an extra d4 of lightning damage when used as a throwing weapon. Most weapons won't apply their additional damage when you throw them, but the Lightning Jabber gets this extra d4 of lightning damage when you throw it. It also, when you hit an enemy with it in melee, has a chance to shock them, applying the Shocking Grasp condition. The tooltip is actually wrong. It says the wrong condition. It says you have shocked. It says that it applies shocked, but it actually applies Shocking Grasp. Those are different conditions. The one that it applies prevents enemies from taking reactions. The main use of this weapon, obviously, is going to be as a throwing weapon, because the extra d4 of lightning damage makes it the highest damage throwing weapon in the game at this point in the game, because d6 plus a d4 of throwing damage is just a very powerful amount of damage in and of itself. It is not a returning weapon, so you need a way to get it back, or you only get one use of it per combat unless you can get over to it and pick it back up. But that's okay. There's a couple ways around that. Firstly, it's the best in slot weapon for an Eldritch Knight thrower, because they can bond this weapon and just use it as a returning weapon, and it'll do more damage than any other thrown weapon at this point in the game. Secondly, you can use it as your first attack with like a barbarian thrower, and then just swap to the returning pike for the rest of your attacks in that combat. You don't have to throw a returning weapon. I feel like people often get stuck on that, but you can just throw other stuff, and the Lightning Jabber gives you a little bit of extra opening damage. There's also a bug you can abuse here, where you can have a different Eldritch Knight, like a camp follower Eldritch Knight, bind the weapon to themselves, pass it over to your thrower, and then it'll still be a returning weapon for that thrown weapon character. That's an interaction that's probably not intended to work, but does, so if you're happy to abuse that bug, then you can use it as a returning weapon on any character using that. The other thing about the Lightning Jabber is that this extra d4 of damage is incredibly buggy on Tactician mode or below, and still reasonably buggy on Honor mode. Just like with the Rat Bat, this extra d4 of damage is a damage rider and a damage rider source, meaning that it is going to apply other damage riders with itself and be applied by other damage riders multiple times. So you can use the Lightning Jabber to stack up ridiculous amounts of extra damage with the Ring of Flinging and Tavern Brawler, which all interact together to stack a whole bunch of damage on this character, way more than it's supposed to do. On Honor mode, a couple of these interactions still do work. This weapon is bugged and just does more damage than it's supposed to. Even without those bugs, it's the highest damage throwing weapon at this point in the game, so it's very, very useful for thrown weapon characters. But also, if you're willing to lean into the bugs with this weapon, it's going to do way more damage than you can get it to do way more damage than it should. And even if you just do the sort of normal build on Tactician or below with Tavern Brawler and the Ring of Flinging, which obviously you want for your thrown weapon characters, you're going to get more damage than you should, even if you don't try to abuse the bugs with the Lightning Jabber. So this weapon is just a ton of damage. Thrown weapon characters are some of the strongest in the game, very, very powerful strategy, and this is the best weapon for them, bug abuse or no, so obviously an extremely powerful weapon that you definitely want if you have a thrower in your party. Moving on to number 8, I'm going to mention that this next weapon has pretty significant story spoilers associated with it, so if this is your first time through the game and you're trying to avoid spoilers, I'll give you a count of 3 to skip this weapon. 3, 2, 1, and moving on to number 8, we've got Selune's Spear of Night. Selune's Spear of Night is a +3 legendary spear, which obviously is great in and of itself, because a +3 weapon hits more often, does more damage, though you probably have the Blood of Lathander at this point, which, when used as an actual weapon, is typically a little bit better, because it has passive bonuses, in addition to being a +3 weapon. The Spear of Night also gives you a bunch of effects that you can activate once per long rest, as well as a pretty nice passive, though. Firstly, you get Moonbeam as the Druid spell, once per long rest, at level 3, which is not bad. Moonbeam is a pretty good spell, but at this point in the game, it's certainly less exciting than it would be earlier on, so a level 3 spell slot once per long rest will improve your party's longevity, but isn't something that I'm going to be extremely excited about. The second thing is that it gives you advantage on wisdom saving throws, which is very, very useful if your character is struggling with wisdom saves. Any melee character or character that doesn't have high wisdom can get in a lot of trouble because wisdom saves tend to be the most debilitating conditions in the game. Things like being mind controlled and stunned are often wisdom saves, and so having high wisdom and advantage on wisdom saves can be super, super useful. This can help mitigate that problem if you have a character who's struggling in that regard. Lastly, it gives you the Moonmote ability. Moonmote is a once per long rest ability that makes all of your allies' weapon attacks deal an extra d4 of radiant damage in a giant AoE, and enemies have to make a saving throw or they treat the area as difficult terrain. This is a huge amount of damage and slows all enemies, so while it's not going to single-handedly win the encounter for you, this basically is once per long rest you have an enormous advantage in a given encounter, meaning that you can use this ability to win an otherwise quite difficult fight. It's on a long rest cooldown though, so this ability is only useful once per day. And the other abilities of this weapon are fine, but not something that would want me to make it a primary weapon. So you're mostly going to use this on a character that doesn't really need its weapon slot. So it can happily equip this weapon for one really difficult encounter per day. If you do that, though, then it's going to really improve your party's effectiveness in that encounter, which is very good because some encounters are very hard and you need every advantage that you can get. Selune's Spear of Night does that. Used as a weapon itself, though, honestly, it's a little disappointing for a legendary weapon. So mostly you're using this weapon if you're struggling with wisdom saves and to win one fight per day. But winning one fight per day is just a pretty powerful effect for a weapon to have anyways, so very much worth hanging on to. At number 7, the Render of Mind and Body. The Render of Mind and Body is another weapon for dual wielders. It's a +1 short sword that deals an extra d8 of psychic damage whenever you attack with advantage. In Act 2, there's a lot of ways, like the Risky Ring and the gauntlets, the automaton gauntlets, that allow you to just make all of your attacks with advantage. So for any character that has an easy source of advantage, the Render of Mind and Body is basically a +1 short sword with an extra d8 of psychic damage all the time. The weapon to compare this to, of course, is the Short Sword of Lifestealing that we already talked about earlier, because that does an extra 10 damage on a critical hit and is probably the second weapon that you have on a dual-wielding character at this point, in addition to the Knife of the Undermountain King, which is better than both of these. And the question is the Render better than the Sword of Lifestealing? The answer is, in my opinion, it is. Even though it has one less enhancement bonus, the extra d8 of psychic damage is on all the time, so even if you're not getting critical hits, then you're still doing extra damage on every attack, which is great. And if you do get a critical hit, 1d8 damage doubled, because this is a damage die, so it gets doubled on crits, is on average 9 damage, so you're only losing 1 damage compared to the Sword of Lifestealing, in exchange for getting more damage on every non-critical attack that you make. So for most dual-wielder characters, you're going to want to use this, in addition to the Knife of the Undermountain King, for the best setup. Of course, if you have a different character that needs the knife, like a Great Old One Warlock or an Archer, then you just use the Sword of Lifestealing and the Render together for your optimal dual-wielding setup. Any character with easy sources of advantage can make use of this weapon. It's also a decent weapon even if you're not a dual wielder, but because it's a short sword, it's usually going to go on dual wielding characters. But it just does a decent amount of damage. This weapon just has great stats. It's also notable that it is psychic damage, and the Resonant Stone can give enemies vulnerability to psychic damage, so that can double the 1d8 psychic damage. So this is pretty useful if you're doing some kind of Resonant Stone build for your party and want extra sources of psychic damage as well. This weapon is just good because it does a lot of damage, and that's what weapons are all about, so good weapon. Coming in at number 6, a weapon we've already touched on a couple times, the Hellfire Hand Crossbow. The Hellfire Hand Crossbow is a +2 hand crossbow with a bunch of additional effects. So obviously it's just strictly better than the +2 hand crossbow that we already said was a pretty decent weapon to have, because the Hellfire Hand Crossbow is that plus a little bit more. Firstly, it can inflict burning when you attack from hiding, which is an occasional extra d4 of damage when you attack from hiding. That's not that exciting, but, you'll take every little bit of damage that you can get on this weapon. And secondly, it lets you cast Scorching Ray once per short rest. Burning, the extra burning damage is the main thing here, honestly, for the Hellfire Hand Crossbow. It's just slightly better than the +2 hand crossbow. Again, hand crossbows have fairly weak options, but it's such a powerful strategy that we're happy to use these weapons anyways. And the Hellfire Hand Crossbow also makes a great offhand weapon attack if you don't have a dedicated hand crossbow character. This is obviously the best version of that random offhand attack that we've talked about several times when it comes to hand crossbows. In addition to that, Scorching Ray once per short rest is not that exciting for archers, but is very good for sorcerers, wizards, bards, etc. that are using higher save DCs and hit chance with their Scorching Ray. This gives those characters quite a bit of extra damage and longevity, especially if you're a fire sorcerer that's themed around Scorching Ray as a spell, using like the Hat of Fire Acuity and stuff. The Hellfire Hand Crossbow makes a very good offhand weapon for them. But for any spellcaster, this doesn't really take a weapon slot, or doesn't really take a slot because it's just an offhand weapon that you can just have equipped in your ranged weapon slot, so it's basically free to have the Hellfire Hand Crossbow, and gives you a pretty powerful effect once per day. So not only is this the best hand crossbow for hand crossbow users, it's also the best hand crossbow for spellcasters, making it a very valuable weapon for your party to have, and widely applicable, even if you don't have the character that you might think would be the one to use it. Worth noting, also very good for thief rogues, because this can be your weapon equipped in your offhand, and a thief rogue, even if you're built as a melee character, 2 offhand attacks with the Hellfire Hand Crossbow is a lot of extra damage, so any character with levels in thief rogue wants to have this weapon in order to just have a great ranged weapon option available at any time. And moving on to the 5 best weapons in Act 2, weighing in at number 5, the Darkfire Shortbow. This is available right from the beginning of Act 2 and is a +2 shortbow. But the main use of this weapon, like a lot of the best weapons in the game, is actually not to attack with the weapon, but to have it on a character that doesn't need their ranged weapon. Just like the Bow of Awareness that we got in Act 1, the Darkfire Shortbow has a super powerful passive effect that applies regardless of whether you're actually using it as your weapon. In this case, resistance to fire and cold damage. Those are the 2 most common types of elemental damage in the game, so resistance to fire and cold damage is going to be incredibly relevant throughout the entire game and is going to make your characters much, much more survivable, and this does it effectively for free. The ability to cast haste once per long rest is also a nice bonus for this weapon. It just gives you a little bit of extra value on a character that will probably be pretty good at maintaining concentration on haste, because this will often go on a spellcaster who will be built into trying to maintain concentration, or a melee character who will often have high constitution saves just by default, so you'll be able to cast haste and get a lot of value out of that. Haste, of course, very good spell, so this gives your party more longevity and more power in an adventuring day, but the real benefit here is the passive effect. Damage resistance makes that type of damage more or less not a factor, because taking half damage from something, especially if an encounter is themed to do specifically fire damage or cold damage, makes that character more or less invincible in any reasonable circumstances in that encounter. You know, if you're supposed to be able to beat the encounter while taking full damage from it, you can definitely beat the encounter while taking half damage from it. So it just wins a bunch of encounters, and again, this is totally free value, so any character can use this in order to get a huge amount of bonus. Just the fact that this is free makes it awesome. Don't use this on archers. They're the only character that doesn't want it because they actually want to attack with their bows. But for any character that's not attacking with their ranged weapon, the Darkfire Shortbow is an extremely premium item. Coming in at number 4, the Halberd of Vigilance. This is one of my favorite weapons in the game, and one that I use pretty much every run if I have a character that uses a two-handed weapon. The Halberd of Vigilance is a +2 halberd, so already a pretty nice weapon, just a +2 weapon. And being a halberd, it has extra reach, which makes it both work with Sentinel and Polearm Master and stuff like that, but also just gives you a little more agency over the battlefield with longer range on your melee attacks. It also does an extra d4 of force damage, which is great because it's extra damage, which obviously we want on a weapon, and it's force damage, which we already talked about a couple times, why that's so good. Some enemies are vulnerable, almost nothing resists it, and it can also be used to trigger some pretty cool debuffs and effects. In addition to that, the Halberd of Vigilance has 2 super powerful passive effects. Firstly, whenever you make an attack as a reaction, you make it with advantage, so this is great for melee attackers, especially in combination with the extra reach of the halberd. Enemies moving away from you and triggering attacks of opportunity, you're going to hit much more often. And you get a +1 bonus to your initiative, and I've talked extensively about how good initiative is, especially on the kind of character that wants this kind of weapon, because great weapon characters can often struggle to get enough initiative. The Halberd of Vigilance helps solve that problem. Most honor mode parties are going to want to end the game with roughly +8 to +10 initiative on every character. That I think is a pretty safe amount to aim for alongside alert and stuff like that, if you are trying to optimize victory. And so the Halberd of Vigilance helps you reach that number very much more smoothly because it gives it to you on what is also an extremely powerful weapon. Special mention for this weapon as well for Battlemaster fighters with the riposte weapon action, because if an enemy misses you with an attack, you get to make an attack as a reaction against them, and then you do get advantage on that attack roll with the Halberd of Vigilance, so that works very well. It doesn't actually synergize super heavily with the Sentinel reaction attack, because Sentinel already gives you advantage on opportunity attacks, so it's kind of redundant with that. But for other sources of attacks as a reaction, the Halberd of Vigilance bonus is very good, and just the stats on this weapon are amazing. This is another one that's just a big pile of good stats all on a single package, and it adds up to one of the better weapons in the game, and one that you're definitely going to be using if you have a character that uses this kind of weapon. Weighing in at number 3, the Infernal Rapier. The Infernal Rapier is a +2 rapier that you get near the end of Act 2, so you're mostly using this for Act 3, which does ding it a little bit because it shows up a little bit later in the game, but the weapon itself is so powerful that it stays on your characters for a big chunk of Act 3 and is useful throughout the entire rest of the game. It's a +2 weapon that gives you a +1 to your save DCs, so very good for any character that's attacking with its weapon and casting spells. And when you attack with the weapon, you use your spellcasting modifier instead of your strength or dexterity in order to calculate weapon attack rolls and damage. The tooltip says just attack rolls, but it is actually both attack rolls and damage that you get from the Infernal Rapier. So if you are, for example, a sword bard, you can benefit from 20 charisma and still attack with maximum attack bonus with this weapon, and get a + to your spell save DCs. In addition to those effects, which are already very good, once per long rest, you can cast Planar Ally, a 6th level spell, to summon a Cambion. Now, the Cambion is the worst of the Planar Ally summons by a pretty wide margin. Both the Jinn and the Deva are much better than the Cambion, but the Cambion is still a 6th level summon and a very powerful thing to just have on an item, so you get a huge buff once per day just by having this item equipped. not only is this weapon very good just as a weapon in and of itself, it also gives you a massive benefit once per day and gives your whole party a huge boost to its power level. It's especially good for any kind of caster because this is... remember that a staff that just boosts your save DC was something we were very excited by in Act 1. This is that, but wildly powered up because it gives you that and a whole bunch of other effects. So the Infernal Rapier is good for any caster, but especially casters that are making weapon attacks. Special note for paladins as well, because it lets you build your charisma to maximum level and attack with your charisma instead of your strength or dex, meaning that you can get the paladin aura at max strength, meaning that you can actually use your spells and have enemies fail the saving throws. So very, very good for paladins. Weirdly enough, it's actually a little bit weaker for Pact of the Blade Warlocks, i.e. for Will in his canonical form, than for other spellcasters, because they already get the melee caster effect effectively. So it's a little redundant for Pact of the Blade Warlocks, though still very good. But for any spellcaster that wants a bonus to their save DCs, i.e. all of them, and especially for any spellcaster that is making weapon attacks, the Infernal Rapier is a top tier weapon that will stay on your character all game. Moving on to number 2, we have Shar's Spear of Evening. It might surprise you that this is showing up at number 2, but you'll understand why when you see the weapon I've placed at number 1. Shar's Spear of Evening might be the best weapon in the entire game to use as an actual weapon, even better than a lot of Act 3 weapons. It does require a specific story choice, so you do have to, and it's a fairly unusual story choice for most players, so a lot of playthroughs won't get this, but if you do, it is definitely worth it. Firstly, it gives you at-will casts of darkness. Once per turn, you can just cast darkness. Darkness is an incredibly powerful effect in Baldur's Gate, making you immune to ranged attacks from enemies and giving you advantage on your attacks if you can see through the darkness, and enemies disadvantage on their attacks if they're in melee with you. Secondly, you get advantage on all of your saving throws while you are in an unlit area, while you're lightly or heavily obscured. And if an enemy is lightly or heavily obscured, you deal an extra d6 damage to them. Note that the tooltip says this weapon deals an extra d6 damage to them. That's not true. It's all weapon attacks, so your ranged weapon attacks will deal an extra d6 damage to them as well. You also gain blind immunity, which also makes you immune to the effect of darkness, so you get a built-in darkness immunity when you're using Shar's Spear of Evening, and a weapon attack that lets you effectively cast darkness as a weapon attack. So Edge of Darkness is a damaging weapon attack that also creates a cloud of darkness. So not only do you get at-will casts of darkness, you can also cast it without spending an action at all and still just make a weapon attack, giving you all of the listed benefits, because of course all of these things trigger off of being in darkness just from the weapon. That is an incredibly powerful weapon set just by itself that gets even more powerful if your party has synergy with it. If you have other characters that operate well in darkness, like a Warlock, for example, any characters with 2 levels in Warlock, any characters wearing the Eversight ring for blind immunity and such, then you can build an entire party around this weapon, and it is even more ridiculously powerful there. Whoops, I also just realized I had a copy-paste error. I had put initiative here. That is the one thing this weapon doesn't do. It doesn't give you a bonus to your initiative. But it also, even if you're not using it as a weapon and don't have a party built around it, the passive benefits of this weapon are still just incredibly ridiculous. Advantage on saving throws is incredibly powerful, and this is a pretty easy condition to meet. And you can use it to trigger the bonus weapon damage with ranged weapons, which is very powerful as well. Immunity to blinded, even if you're not abusing darkness clouds, still comes up in some encounters, but also just being able to cast darkness on non-warlock characters is incredible. Every character can benefit from Shar's Spear of Evening. The total package that it gives you is just incredibly powerful, and there is no reason, if you have this weapon, not to build your party around it because of just how good it is. It's going to eclipse pretty much anything else that you can do in the game. Now, having said that this is the best weapon in the game, what could I possibly put at number 1 ahead of it? The answer, of course, is the Drakethroat Glaive. The Drakethroat Glaive is a +2 glaive, but mostly that doesn't matter. The real advantage of this weapon, despite being a pretty good weapon in and of itself, the real advantage of this weapon is that it lets you cast Draconic Elemental Weapon, and you don't have to use that on itself. Any weapon can be enchanted with the Drakethroat Glaive by dropping it on the ground, activating the glaive, and enchanting that weapon. Draconic Elemental Weapon is a spell that lasts all day and is the same as the Elemental Weapon spell, the level 3 Paladin spell, except that it doesn't require concentration, giving the weapon that you enchant with it a +1 bonus, so a +1 enchantment bonus, +1 to attack and damage, and an extra d4 of damage of an element type of your choice. Usually that's going to be cold or thunder, though there's a couple other circumstances where you might choose a different one. This means that without taking up a weapon slot, and it's truly without taking up a weapon slot, you don't even need to dedicate like an offhand ranged weapon slot to this, any character can have a massive bonus to their effectiveness with a weapon all day, every day, as long as you have the Drakethroat Glaive in your inventory at all. Anything that doesn't take up any resources in order to use is incredibly powerful, and the bonus that you get from the Drakethroat Glaive is awesome. Turning a +2 weapon into a +3 weapon obviously is ridiculous. Turning a +3 weapon into a +4 weapon is even more ridiculous, and it stacks with the enhancement bonus of weapons, with other enhancement bonuses that you can get from like magic weapon and stuff, to make your weapons just hit every single time as easily as possible. The bonus damage that you get is extremely relevant here as well, because you get additional cold damage, which can then be doubled with the wet condition for even more damage every single attack. Additional thunder damage, which can apply reverberation on weapons that normally wouldn't apply it, and also can be used to stack Arcane Acuity with the helm, the Hat of Storm Scion's power that gives you Arcane Acuity whenever you deal thunder damage. So the Drakethroat Glaive not only just powers up your weapons in a totally resource-free way, it also synergizes extremely well with several of the most powerful effects in the game. I mean, you can see here, this is a laundry list of like the top 3 things that you can be doing in the game, plus like Radiating Orb or whatever would be on that list as well. But the Drakethroat Glaive is perfect for all of those things and doesn't take a weapon slot. You can also just use it as a weapon. Even if you just use it as a +3 weapon that does an extra d4 of cold damage, that's a great weapon. But if you use it in addition to another weapon, then that's where it really comes into its own and powers up your party. The Drakethroat Glaive is good for every single party. If you have any character that's attacking with any weapons ever, this is a massive bonus to your effectiveness, and being incredibly free, it's something that you should definitely never leave behind in Honor Mode. Also worth noting, I guess, you can twin it. This is a spell, so you can twin it if you have a sorcerer and enchant 2 characters' weapons for even more value. But the Drakethroat Glaive's bonuses are super strong and totally free, making it the best weapon in Act 2. Alright, my friends, hope that you have enjoyed this list of the best weapons in Act 2 for Baldur's Gate 3 Honor Mode. As always with these tier lists, if you think there is an item that I have missed or something that I have misplaced, definitely let me know in the comments. I appreciate hearing your thoughts, and we have definitely moved things around as a result of good enough arguments in the comments, so let me know if you think there's something that I should move. If you have enjoyed the video, then of course feel free to hit like and leave any comment. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm when people engage with the video, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. That is the best way to help out content creators. If there's somebody that you think you would like to help out on YouTube, the YouTube algorithm cares very deeply about engagement, so just pushing buttons is really nice to help out. Of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more of this. We'll be back with Act 3, other Baldur's Gate 3 strategy guides, and other strategy game analysis, and I will catch you next time. Thank you for watching, my friends. Cheers.